following podcast is for informational purposes only. The contents of this podcast do not constitute tax, legal, or investment advice. Take responsibility for your own decisions, consult with the proper professionals, and do your own research.
GRTiQ podcast.
Welcome to the GRTiQ podcast. Today is part one of our two-part look back on the guests, ideas, and stories that shaped the GRTiQ podcast in 2023. It's incredible to think we're finishing another year, and this is our third consecutive year of releasing best of episodes. We just want to say thank you to all the amazing guests who joined the podcast during 2023, and to all of you, the loyal listeners who make this podcast possible. Thank you. During this episode, you'll hear excerpts from episodes 98 through 122. Next week, during part 2, you'll hear excerpts from the remaining episodes that helped finish the year. We'll be back with new episodes of the podcast to start 2024. Until then, please enjoy listening to part 1 of the best of 2023.
Episode 98.
Joining us for episode 98 was Marc-Andre Dumas, an active player in the indexer community and the force behind Ellipra. Listen as Marc-Andre recounts his initial fascination with the graph and what captured his attention.
Yeah, well, it was back in early 2019, I think even before I joined MakerDAO. And I must confess, the graph didn't make a great first impression on me. You know, as part of my exploration of crypto and the crypto and blockchain space, I had been trying to track every single project in the space, and it was getting overwhelming. There were so many new projects popping up, and most of them weren't very credible or were just rehashes of old ideas. We had just experienced the ICO craze. So that's the context. So I started using simple mental filters to quickly determine which project were worth paying attention to. And as part of these filters, I had the filter saying that, well, if a project has a well-funded marketing campaign, that's a big red flag. So the graph was a major sponsor of the eDenver that year. And I had never heard of them before, so it didn't start off with the right foot on me. I mean, it was a quick filter. It had a good hit rate, but yeah, it failed sometimes, and it failed with the graph. I was also building at the time analytics reports for MakerDAO, and so I understood the difficulties of extracting blockchain data. But also from that perspective, I didn't see a huge market for analytics, and I thought it was a small niche that already had a good set of players. So I listened to a presentation about the graph in Denver, and I forgot about it for a while. And fast forward summer 2020, and I wake up and realize that how stupid I was to overlook the usefulness of subgraphs for building dApp front ends. At that point, everyone was using the graph. So yeah, I started paying a little more attention at that point.
Episode 99.
For episode 99, Brian Berman, ecosystem brand and marketing manager at Edge & Node, joined us. Here, Brian shares how he explains the graph to family and friends when he decided to make the shift to Web3.
Yeah, so I really love sharing with my friends and family what the graph does, what it's about. And I tend to start with the fact that we're living in the information age, where accessing, organizing, and analyzing data is extremely important in almost everything that we do. So let's say with this explanation, we're assuming that the starting point is we know that blockchains are public ledgers of transaction data. They've existed for about 14 years, and they're not going away. They're just generating more data. In fact, in the past 5 seconds you've been listening, all the active blockchains in the world just recorded tens of thousands of transactions. That's a lot of data. But there's also another important thing to remember here. The data on blockchains is completely unsorted other than happening at a certain place in time. So if you wanted to get anything meaningful out of that data, it'd be like looking for a needle in a haystack. blockchains are read optimized, not write optimized. And that's where the graph comes in. The graph, through open source APIs called subgraphs, organizes blockchain data so you can find exactly what you need from blockchains. And everyone needs data if they want to build meaningful applications on top of blockchains. So the graph organizes that data so that people can display it. So people like you and me can actually browse and understand blockchain data across tens of thousands of applications in this new era of the decentralized internet. So to better explain how the graph does it, imagine you have a massive swimming pool that was somehow constantly getting deeper. Now imagine that every minute a truck comes and dumps a truckload of M&Ms into that pool, or you might call them Smarties in other countries. And that pool is constantly filling up. That's what blockchains look like. They're like expanding pools because more data can infinitely be added to them. So the M&Ms represent data that is added every time a block is validated by the network of a blockchain. And let's say you've been tasked with the job to fish out all the orange M&Ms in this pool. Let's say those orange M&Ms represent DeFi data. So you could dive into that pool of M&Ms and get totally lost and probably get a sugar high and fail at even getting close to retrieving all those M&Ms. But imagine you had a magic net that was so powerful, all you had to do was take one scoop at the pool and it'd pick up all the orange M&Ms and filter everything else out. That's the graph. The graph is a magic filter for helping you find exactly what you need on the blockchain.
Episode 100.
Our milestone 100th episode featured Yaniv Tal, CEO and founder at Geo, and co-founder of Edgenode and The Graph. This was an enlightening episode where Yaniv offered many incredible insights into his personal background, along with the origins of The Graph. Here, Yaniv talks about some of the light bulb moments that eventually led to the launch of the Graph protocol.
I think there were a few kind of aha moments that led to it. So some of the initial ideas predate to when I was in college, in that period when I started thinking about internet native institutions and that we needed, new ways to scale human coordination. And then I think a second light bulb moment was during that time at Workflow, right, where we were building this framework that was doing, essentially like GraphQL on top of immutable databases. And at that time, I kind of had this realization that the end state for something like GraphQL would be that you would want to link all of the data across these APIs together. And, for example, an organization like Facebook, which is a massive organization, has a giant GraphQL API with all of the different users and events and interests and hosts and all these different things. And most of the organizations that use GraphQL, have a giant global GraphQL API, but there's no reason to limit these things to within organizational boundaries, right? Because all information is relational. And so you'd actually want to link all of these APIs together into really a global GraphQL API. But then at that moment, I'd stopped and I wondered well, who would you want to run the global API for everything? Would Facebook do it? Would Google do it? It's too much power for any one company to have. And so the thought kind of stopped there. But I think, that was kind of an initial, maybe second seed for the idea of the graph. But then finally, we actually decided to get started working on the graph. That was in 2017. And, Ethereum was taken off and it was kind of hard to ignore. And, we found ourselves talking about Ethereum and dApps and blockchains and the stuff. Every opportunity we had was really a contagious idea. And at that point, I had realized that finally, we had the tools to build the kinds of things that, I was thinking about in college, that, now we have programmable money and we have these smart contracts where we could define open, transparent rules and we could start to design sophisticated economic systems the same way that we design circuits. And so I got really excited by the promise of decentralization and giving power to individuals and to small teams instead of having these giant corporations and monopolies that that end up taking all the power and dictating everything. So we were really bought into this idea of decentralization. And so I started just working on like a prototype dApp to see, what we could build. And right away, I realized that it was too hard to get the data from my Ethereum smart contract. And really what I wanted was a GraphQL API that I could just hit so I could build my dApp. And that was kind of the aha moment of like, we're actually missing this, because if I was going to solve this myself, I would have to run a server, and then that would defeat the whole purpose of having a decentralized application. And so that's when we realized that we were missing a protocol, and that this protocol should run on a decentralized network so that there's no company that's in control of the data. And that way people could build dApps that they just publish to open public infrastructure and really easily build those applications. And that was kind of the beginning of the idea for the graph.
Episode 101.
From episode 101, here's Clabris with GRTiQ, a team of accounting and financial experts who, among other things, help DAOs and foundations optimize their treasuries. This is what Clabris had to say when asked about how important the graph is for Web3.
I can see that in different ways. As a user, I think it's super important to have this data in an accessible way and transparent to users, let's say for governance. Yeah, there's so many things you can do. At GRTiQ is mostly about reporting. There's no use to have all of this data if it's not very easy to access. And then I would say for a network like Gnosis Chain, it's super important because it's what builders are using, right? So it should be available absolutely everywhere.
Episode 102.
And here for episode 102 is Alejandro with Crebit, a solution for managing personal and professional credit in Web3. This is how Alejandro describes how important the graph is for developers like himself building in Web3.
So I would say the graph is a key part of what we are doing, because when you're talking about blockchain apps, you need the blockchain to actually write things that you want to write. But the graph is one of the best ways to read from the blockchain. So all the information that we want to access in a cost-efficient way, it's better to do it using the graph. And it's also much easier for other apps to tap into the data that is stored on-chain using the graph instead of going directly to the on-chain, which is much more hard to do. So it really simplifies the stack for Web3, and it also kind of reduces the costs. So it's very important.
Episode 103.
And now Chris Lasut, co-founder of Request Network and co-founder and CEO at Request Finance from episode 103. Here, Chris talks about when he first became aware of the graph and what his initial thoughts were about the protocol.
Yeah, so I knew about the graph for a very long time. I was happy to hear that the engineers in our team decided to use the graph. I think that's when I decided to buy some tokens. I was like, okay, good product. And I understood that it was protocol that still needed more decentralization, but that's key for our payment detection ability. And I also understand why it was built the way it's been built, because basically starting in a more centralized way to have something efficient to get product market fit or protocol market fit, makes total sense. And then switching to a more decentralized protocol, which is the case today, also makes sense. So I'm glad that such projects exist. I think it's one of the pillars in the space.
Episode 104.
Now AJ Warner from episode 104, Chief Strategy Officer at Off-Chain Labs, the founding team behind Arbitrum. This is AJ sharing his perspective for how important the graph is for Web3.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know if I'm the best to answer this because I'm not like the most, from a data perspective, the most like savvy technical guy, but it is important, right? The ability to have confidence in the data that you're digesting, the importance of it being able to be accessible by anyone, the importance of being able to self-host your data and make it like readable is critical. I think what they're doing now is, they've got a ton of adoption. Basically, everybody's using some graphs in some component. I think it's critical. I think, if we want to have the data component of what's happening on blockchains digestible, it has to be part of the decentralized stack, essentially. That's how I think about it in terms of their importance. And I think, I know Tegan is extremely passionate about this. Obviously, the rest of the team is, and I'm sure you are as well. Making the data digestible is an extremely important component of what we're all trying to do.
Episode 105.
From episode 105, the GRTiQ podcast welcomed Daniel, Ariel, Simone, and Pablo from the Edge and Node team to talk about the graph's move to L2. This is Pablo explaining some of the benefits to ecosystem contributors associated with the graph moving to L2 and why it matters.
So I think it all comes down to one word, and that word is gas. The main difficulty we have if staying in Ethereum mainnet is that gas prices can be really, really high. Right now, they're better than maybe at the height of the craziness that Ariel mentioned in 2021, but it's still significant cost for everyone that wants to participate in the protocol. So by moving to Arbitrum, we're able to reduce those costs a lot. For instance, I checked maybe last week, and a simple token transfer, a GRT transfer cost more than $3 in gas, whereas doing that same thing on Arbitrum cost about 7 cents. So this is a very important reduction, and this affects everyone. So if you're an indexer, then all of your operating costs become cheaper, and this affects everyone else, and so on. And this also opens up the space for us to do more improvements to the protocol and the economic mechanisms that make the network work. We're kind of limited in mainnet as to what kind of computation we can do there, because everything we do can be very, very expensive, especially if gas price goes up. But on Arbitrum, we still have to be very careful. We can't just add, a very weird algorithm that takes up a lot of gas. But we can experiment a bit more and produce something that might be a bit more complex or infeasible in mainnet, but it's still reasonable cost on Arbitrum. So it really opens up a lot of possibilities.
Episode 106.
For episode 106, the GRTiQ podcast welcomed Ani, Tomas, and Sam from Semiotic Labs to talk about artificial intelligence and crypto. Here is Sam answering the question of where should we start when we think about the intersection between AI and crypto.
Yeah, where do we start? So it makes sense why everybody's excited to me. And the excitement was triggered by ChatGPT, which from here on in the conversation, I'm going to generalize as large language models or LLMs. ChatGPT, remember, is a type of LLM. Everybody is really excited at the end of the day because we're now seeing what LLMs can do. Actually, we do have a real breakthrough, in my opinion, in the types of problems that could be solved. This is what we now know. And because of this just general excitement in what LLMs are doing, we're going to see over the next few years a lot of startups claiming to be built on top of LLMs. So there's going to be a lot of VC money. There already is. There are a lot of products already started, a lot of companies already starting based on LLMs, a lot of VC money based on LLMs. Now let's focus in crypto. If you said something was an AI token, then that's like telling me that the project is a math token. My question is, what is going to be done with the math? It's a very nebulous sort of thing. You need an actual application. Let's look at Google, for example. Google employs more AI researchers and have done more to advance the state of the field of AI than any other company that I'm aware of. But they don't bill themselves as an AI company, right? The thing is, though, is they have attributes that make it so that AI can amplify the data that they do have. So similarly, when I look at crypto, I'm interested in, okay, where can AI help the projects that exist in crypto? A few come to mind. Filecoin is one. LivePeer is one. And of course, the graph is one. Filecoin and Lipeer, by the way, just for the audience, I know the team there, those are really familiar projects to me. That's why I mentioned them. But all three of those that I mentioned, we have a ton of data that's organized in some way. And data is really what you need if you want to start doing interesting AI applications.
Episode 107.
And now, James Hall, design manager at Edge and Node, talking about the aha moment that solidified his vision for joining Edge and Node and going to work on the graph during episode 107.
My favorite class in my MBA program was a macroeconomics class. And it's really the only economics class I've ever taken, but it was really impactful. I view myself as a pretty logical individual, and learning about the underlying mechanics of how economics work was really resonated with me. So as I started learning about Web3 broadly and the potential it had to bring radical information transparency to public behavior and spending and all of these things, that got me excited. And then the thing that really hooked me was the economics of the graph ecosystem. I really think it's a work of art that all of the participants in the graph network have mutually aligned incentives to help the network grow, to be good citizens, to look out for each other. And it's definitely evident in the culture of the community as well, that you have a question about how to be a better indexer. Guess what? There will be other indexers there that you're competing with, but they'll be answering your question and trying to help you on your way. Because as the graph improves and becomes stronger, everyone benefits. And for me, that moment of realizing how complex the economics were, but in a way that all led to this radical collaboration and cooperation, really for me was that was when I was totally sold. And when I reached out to Carl was after that.
Episode 108.
From episode 108, this is Darby Poptones, a graph advocate and member of Graph Advocates DAO. Here, Darby talks about what she's learned about the graph community by virtue of going to work as an advocate and working in the Advocates DAO.
Oh man, everyone's just so motivated and mission aligned. And I think that's really, really great to see. And it's incredibly reassuring because it makes me feel like I'm in the right place, but also that everyone else is in the right place. And it's incredibly enlightening, I think, because when I see the graph and the advocates program, it reminds me of why I joined crypto to begin with. And it's great to see people joining crypto and these protocols for more than just financial reasons and actually wanting to better the world together.
Episode 109.
Here's Facu Spagnolo, co-founder at Mimic, an innovative DeFi dApp that makes interacting with DeFi simpler and safer. During episode 109, Facu talked about how important the graph is to Mimic and other builders building within Web3.
Well, basically, there's a huge gap between, let's say, the smart contract and the end user. You cannot go over the EVM and start reading information just manually to populate the UI to show something to your users. I'm not even saying about querying stuff, but if you need to do add some kind of logic there, like if you want to do, accountancy or probabilities or doing some math to reduce the information. If you go over Balancer, again, as an example, if you want to show TVL or a value in USD or the slippage or different type of values that the end user needs to know when they need to interact with your platform. You don't have those values in the blockchain. You need to reduce all the information to produce them out. Without the graph, that's impossible. Or you need to figure out your own way of doing it. I heard there are a few projects that build their own reducing logic to produce that type of information, but probably those are big projects that can probably dedicate a full team to do it. And it's not even a decentralized solution, right? The graph makes it also decentralized. So I would say they're filling that gap between wherever information is stored in the blockchain, the EVM, and whatever information is shown to the user. And there's a huge gap there. I'm sure maybe it's hard to understand it, but if you start working on a smart contract if you want to show some information about it to your end user, you will understand what I'm saying. There's a huge gap. Maybe it's not easy to see it from the outside, but when you start doing it, they really solve the problem. They give you a lot of tools to make that happen really easy. Otherwise, again, as I was saying before, the graph, doing that manually, I mean, you can figure it out, but it was always custom solutions, different solutions out there, no standardization. And it's really hard for a community to grow in that sense, right? If we're all together towards in the same direction and following the same standards, it's easier.
Episode 110.
For episode 110, the GRTiQ podcast welcome Abhinav and Vikash from DAppLooker, which is an indexer, but also a powerful Web3 analytics team building incredible dashboards and analytics for Web3. Here's Abhinav talking about what the team has learned about the graph by virtue of building an analytics solution, along with many insightful dashboards about the protocol.
Yes, so the graph is very important for the Web3 community because as you know, like it's the search engine for the Web3 data. So what make it more easy to get Web3 data using a GraphQL endpoint, which we call subgraph endpoint. And the graph is building that subgraph more and more useful for the community. And they're working with the graph client so that the community can easily access data using the subgraph endpoint. So there's lots of utility we have found using the graph. And as you know, like we have like one of the trusted data sources subgraph. So we are using that. And apart from that, like we have also built GraphLooker, which is real-time Web3 data visualizer. So that's also based on subgraph endpoint. So we have lots of idea, and I believe like the community also have lots of idea about the utility using the graph, what the graph provides. So like I can talk a lot about this. I find it very useful.
Episode 111.
Here's Vincent Chi from episode 111. Vincent is a Web3 full-stack engineer working at Superfluid, and here he explains how Superfluid, something that's revolutionizing how payments work in crypto, uses the graph.
Yeah, so we rely on the graph quite a bit for all of our user-facing products. So it's quite an important piece of our stack. We utilize it in our dashboard. This is the site where you can view your ongoing streams, create, update, and delete your streams. We also use it in our console, which can be considered something like Etherscan, but just for Superfluid, where you can query information about streams and instant distribution agreements. And it's also part of our SDK. So leveraging the graph, we store, three types of entities: events, higher order entities, and aggregate entities. And this is going into a bit more of like how we architect our entities and in the subgraph. So it's a bit technical, but not too technical. Event entities are basically just one-to-one mapping of events emitted from the smart contracts. These are transient entities. Once they get emitted, they don't get changed ever for the most part. Then we have something called higher order entities, and these capture state for multiple events over time and are less transient than event entities. For example, we have a stream entity. Lastly, we have aggregate entities, and this captures state over time and are permanent, for example. We have something called a token statistic entity, for example, which captures token-specific stream data over its lifetime, such as current total active streams, the total outflow rate. So using something like the graph allows you to create this type of data in a fairly straightforward way. Whereas if you want to do this by yourself, you would have to basically collect history from the very first time you deploy a specific smart contract you want data for, and then building the data up from there.
Episode 112.
From episode 112, here's Chittaboom, a graph advocate and member of Graph Advocates DAO, sharing what it was like going from someone who had interest in Web3, decided to attend a local Graph birthday event, to joining Graph Advocates and Advocates DAO, contributing to the ecosystem, and then hosting the Graph birthday event only 1 year later.
Wow, I would say the experience has been amazing. It has been a very interesting ride for me because I always, sometimes I try to look back at how it was when I started. I was so nervous. I even recall my second interview when I was applying for the advocates program. I think my interview was with Lorena, and I was so nervous. I had to tell her to stop and we should take a break, maybe a 5-minute break or a water break before I would continue the interview. So I was really nervous starting out, but as time went on and I started contributing, my confidence started to grow. And then I was able to take on more roles because, I started out with one role. And when I felt confident with that, I took on another role. And when I took on the roles, like the second role I took on as a content creator, when I started putting out articles and threads and seeing that I was getting, support from the community, it also grew my confidence as well. And, it grew to the point where I was able to host an event. Hosting an event, it wasn't my first event that I was hosting because I already had prior experience hosting events before. But now hosting an event for the graph, I think that was where I would say I got really confident. And it has been a very interesting journey for me. I would say it's very, very interesting journey. I'm excited, and I would say I'm really excited because I feel like, there's still so much more that I'm yet to do that I haven't done. So I'm very excited.
Episode 113.
And now, here's Lorena Fabris from episode 113. Lorena is a graph advocate and member of Graph Advocates DAO. Here, Lorena talks about why she chose the graph ecosystem to focus her time and energies when there's so many different projects that she could have contributed to.
Well, as I mentioned before, the graph is a protocol. It's more than a protocol. Now it's an ecosystem. There is not a protocol in one blockchain. There is, in general, it's a tool that the 70% of the dev use, in Web3. We need that more people in Web3 nodes and people from Web2 knows about the graph. That is why I'm here. That is why I'm doing what I do. I try to not only devs, because devs is final user. Now they are final user, but companies will use with Substream. Companies or final user, and like me, for example, with Shio or with the news optional Substream, that I don't have to create a query with code to try to have the information. That is why I'm doing this, because for me, the graph is not only a project. It's a necessity. It's a tool that the ecosystem needs. So we need to inform people that what the graph is if they don't know. But most people know what the graph is, and most people use that. When I talk with devs, why do you use the graph? Because we need the graph. We reduce time of query. And I need the information. I go there, I take the information, and it's a fraction of time. That is why we need to inform that. For that reason, I'm very focused on the graph.
Episode 114.
And now Kyle LaRue, graph advocate and member of Graph Advocates DAO for episode 114. Here, Kyle talks about his fellow advocates, what they're like, what they're working on, and what drives their passion to contribute.
Yeah, they are inspiring. They're the diversity of people who are in the program and that are contributing in different ways has been incredible to see, and to get to learn the stories of a lot of these advocates has been really special. And yeah, I'm just blown away by how compelled folks are to contribute towards the graph, in different ways, and they're bringing their own skill set. Whether, like I said, whether it's translation, the graph website, whether it's subgraph documentation, helping out these dApps, provide documentations for their subgraphs for free. It's just been really cool to see the passion that people are bringing to the advocacy.
Episode 115.
From episode 115, this is Denim Preen, co-founder of Float Capital, a DeFi app that provides leverage returns without over-collateralization or liquidations. Here, Denim talks about when he and the Float team first became aware of the graph and what their initial impressions were.
Yeah, absolutely. So we were introduced to the graph pretty early on. It maybe wasn't as big as it is now, and obviously a monolith in the space, providing an absolutely incredible service. It's clearly found product market fit. We were introduced to the graph back at the end of 2019, And I think it was a little bit more clunky back then. I remember sitting with my co-founder in Switzerland and going through a little bit, and the error messages might not have been so helpful as they are now. And, it's a different language to dissect if you're not familiar with assembly script. But, we committed with it. The graph team was super helpful. It really paid off for us in terms of being a technology we could use. And, this problem with solving of capturing or indexing data from the blockchain in a customizable fashion is incredibly useful for building, kind of backends for your data application. And another kind of key point, real time. And what I'm kind of emphasizing is a lot of data or indexing systems, they capture data from the blockchain, but they are staggered. So they take snapshots. I don't know, I won't pick any names out, but essentially they're taking data from the blockchain, which is slightly lagged. So any kind of real-time application, Float, where you perform a transaction to open a position, you need to see that position open when you mint it. And the graph provides this real-time data for kind of indexing this data from the blockchain. And this is really useful for any kind of user-facing app where it needs to be real-time, people are transacting. And yeah, I'm super glad to have kind of explored and taken this journey from initial, developer experience. It's obviously come a long way since then. Been an awesome adventure.
During episode 116, I asked Alyssa Shavinsky, author, Web3 executive, and security expert, about the early days of meeting the graph and what her initial impressions were of the founding team and the protocol.
So early on, I really liked their sincerity, and I thought that their token was very useful, and it made a lot of sense to me. Like, it's very coherent to say that if we're going to build decentralized systems, we don't want to use things like AWS, or like we don't want to use these centralized Web2 tools for decentralized solutions. So the graph always made sense to me because we need those kinds of foundational technologies to actually accomplish the goals that we're setting out to do.
So then why are you such a fan of the project?
Well, it's for that reason, actually, because the founders, the team, they're really sincere and they're doing work that's so important. In 2018, the people I met in the ecosystem were really sincere about crypto values. Crypto values meaning like open source and decentralization and trying to build things that are new, like these wild new visions of what the world could be. As opposed to all these other things we saw in the last bull run, which were a lot more about making money. And, I get it. Making money is really fun and really cool. And like trading tokens can be really fun and really cool. But my heart, what really moves me is these folks are just like really hardcore developers. They just really want to build this stuff, not for day trading, but because we should have a decentralized ecosystem. So I just love the graph because the founders and the people I've met there, they're so smart, but they're so sincere. I just think they're really good people and that they have a vision that really makes sense.
Episode 117.
From episode 117, here's Marissa Posner, co-founder at Chainbrain, an AI app that Chainbrain built during a hackathon in 2023. Chainbrain uses the graph, and here Marissa explains why the team chose the graph and how it makes life easier for builders working in Web3.
Indexing your own node is really time-consuming and cost-prohibitive. So since we built in a hackathon, that didn't make sense for us, which is part of the reason we decided to go with the graph that already had all of this index data easily accessible. I actually was doing a Solana hackathon a couple weeks ago and was pulling data from Solana, and the graph doesn't yet support Solana. Well, they do with substreams, but not with subgraphs yet. And I had to use Helios's API, and it was much more complex. I had to pull the data off, then format it, and then query that data. So it just was a lot more steps, whereas the graph provides a much more accessible and easy to understand data structure right off the bat. And then to your point about how important the decentralization component is, I really think that decentralization is the ethos of Web3 and that not just one person should control the data. So by having the data decentralized, it's spread out among the community and no one has power over creating it or destroying it.
Episode 118.
And now, from episode 118, here's Lauren Feld, founder at Collective Works, which oversees Women's Collective and the Indigo Collective. This is Lauren sharing her perspectives and lessons learned, having worked alongside many entrepreneurial and early-stage ventures, launching in Web3.
It's hard to pinpoint a specific piece of advice that's generalizable, but the things that come to mind for me are, I think, in this space specifically, and I've talked about this a bit already, but the reason I think I like working in crypto and Web3 is because there are so many very technical founders and not as many folks that are coming in from my side of the business now, much more so, right? Like we have much more business operators, and as projects have matured, a lot of people have come in from the Web2 space, but especially in the beginning, but still even to the extent now, a lot of the founders that I work with are very technical. They're really just thinking about, I want to build this thing. I see this kind of technical opportunity, and then they put it out in the market and they wonder why no one's using it. And so I enjoy kind of being the person to help them work backwards to say, hey, like, what was the problem that you were originally trying to solve? I think too many founders build a thing, they go heads down for a year or 2 years, put something out to market, and then wonder why they're not getting traction. And so some of the things that I encourage founders to do are, one, just like really stop building, especially early on. Like don't focus on trying to ship and develop a real product that people are going to use and engage with. Like just start prototyping. Obviously that doesn't work for every project, right? Like if you're building some kind of like ZK roll-up technology, that's hard to prototype. But there's some other like consumer and B2B applications where it's really easy to just create a super lo-fi mock-up, whether it's in Figma or Google Slides or something else, and just go out and start talking to customers. I think too many teams have a lot of in the building thinking, and they really don't go and interface with customers enough and deeply understand the problem. Because for any problem, there's n number of ways that you can solve it, right? Like there's so many different kinds of solutions. And the companies that win figure out exactly how to build the right thing for it to match a very specific problem, like two puzzle pieces. And so I think those are some tangible, suggestions and things that I always think about is, one, how can you start prototyping early? How can you talk to your customers early and often? And then I guess the last thing I'll say is just kind of on the messaging and framing. As you go out and talk to these customers early, I always encourage people to think about this framework, the job to be done, right? And this is from Clayton Christensen, who is very well known in the business space and has written some really great books around this, but really is just thinking about, so many people talk about their product and their service in terms of features and the what and the tech behind it. And customers don't really care about that. They care about the value prop of how are you making my life better and easier. And the job to be done idea is really this framework for thinking about every customer when they make a purchase, when they engage with you, they have a certain job to be done. So this framework comes from an experiment where a marketing agency was working with this fast food company and they were trying to sell more milkshakes. And they were going and asking all their customers questions about the flavors and the consistency. And there were no really good insights and they couldn't really figure out how come we're not selling more of these things. And they actually noticed that a lot of customers were buying milkshakes on their way to work. And so it actually really wasn't a preference for necessarily the flavor or the consistency, but they really just wanted a quick and easy breakfast that they could drink on the go. And so with that unlock, they understood, hey, like our job to be done is that we're an efficient way to kind of fill your belly on the way to work and like get you going and give you something interesting to do while you're driving. And when they did that, they were able to change their whole marketing approach and saw this increase in sales, right? And it's a silly example, but I mean, it really resonates of like, if you have to understand the problem you're solving for your customer and the language you use to talk and communicate with them will make you more successful if you can really resonate with that job to be done. So I love kind of using that framework to help brands think about, how do you talk about what you're building and how you're helping your customers.
Episode 119.
From episode 119, this is Liam Doyle, founder of GRT Data Hub and member of Graftronauts. Here is Liam explaining the story of how he became interested in the graph and how he joined Graftronauts.
Yeah, so as I said previously, like whilst doing this web development bootcamp, I stumbled across the graph by accident when learning. From there, I sort of found myself on Coinbase doing the quiz at the time. So what it does, its impact within Web3. I can't really tell you how I found the Graphtronauts group chat. I'm sure it was named something differently back then. But when the Graphtronauts were formed, I remember seeing members in the group growing and growing like on a weekly basis. I asked a lot of questions at the start. I found the graph documents and then told others about the documents and helped others to answer the questions that I once asked. So in a way, I sort of came full circle in the fact that I was now helping others to realize that sort of light bulb moment that I had in my head. And I could see other people having the same sort of responses and how friendly the community is. And is this really like the next Google of Web3? I mean, GRT, I believe, is the backbone of Web3. It's often echoed, obviously, it's the Google of Web3. And since then, like, I got to know all the Graphtronauts admins really well. Not many people know this, but my brother actually joined the community at the same time as me. So as I was focusing on learning how to code, as I wanted to make new tools, etc. in the future, he turned to the community support side of Web3 in the graph. So I'm moderating, helping, educating, and most important, be welcoming newbies along, like we were at one time. Some of you may know him and some of you may not, but it's actually CM from the Graphtronauts. So if you spent a day probably messaging in that chat, I can guarantee you come across him at some point. It's very helpful, very knowledgeable. Not only did he start the Graph News, which was later produced and then shown weekly on the Graphtronauts YouTube channel, but he also gave me sort of the platform to make these graphs for the weekly stats updates. So from there, GRTiQ was born, or what it was once called, and it was rebranded to, which is actually, it was called Graphtronauts Data, and then later changed to negate any conflict of interest or confusion within the community. Since then, I've gotten to know the admins very well. Some of the best people within Web3 and definitely the graph ecosystem. I mean, there are certain members I cannot thank enough for the help along the way. From, I'm probably going to butcher these names, but I'm going to go for it. From Bag, who taught me how to create my first ever subgraph to get the data for the charts. He's helped me code from the very beginning of my Web3 journey, from where it all started, to Paolo, who, I mean, from day one, has been probably one of the most supportive people that I've met within the graph community. And even to this day, we talk on, if not weekly, a daily basis, and he's still pushing me to improve the app. He's still pushing me to become better at coding. I mean, without the admins within the graph channel, I truly do believe that myself and GRTiQ would not be here today. So yeah, they've helped me a lot.
Episode 120.
And now, Mihai Grigore, head of Web3 protocol research at Masari, who joined us for episode 120. Mihai and his team publish a very popular quarterly report on the graph, and here Mihai talks about what he's learned about the graph by virtue of all the research he's done on the protocol.
Something that I've learned and that's specific to the graph is incentivizing the key ecosystem players to interact with each other. So we do have indexers, we do have curators and delegators who have very, very specific roles in the ecosystem. And what we're observing through the past year is that the community and the whole ecosystem is growing at a significant pace. So we definitely see positive trends in the number of indexers on the graph, and this is a sign of a healthy ecosystem.
Episode 121.
And now from episode 121, this is Petko Pavlovsky. Petko's been in and around the graph ecosystem for a long time and is now part of the GraphOps team. Here is Petko talking about where his conviction for the graph comes from.
So this is a very easy question. First off is, of course, the graph community. The people are amazing. It's literally so many motivated and mission-driven people that it's just, it blows my mind every day. But then the second part of that is I've always known that I want to work in blockchain. And ever since meeting my friend at OVO, I knew that I want to work in blockchain with Rust. And I also knew that I didn't really want to work at a financial blockchain company. And that is why I can't even imagine myself working somewhere other than the graph.
Episode 122.
And lastly, here's Julian Genestal, founder and CEO at Unlock Protocol and member of the Graph Council. Here, Julian talks about when he first became aware of the graph and the journey he made from user of the graph to member of the Graph Council.
It was September 2019. So I think very early on for the Graph as a project, we were already building a bunch of infrastructure that I realized pretty quickly was going to be obsolete because it was painful to build. So basically, simple thing, right? When you send transaction on chain, you have to wait for that transaction to be mined before you can actually retrieve results from there. And if you lost the hash of the transaction, then it's really hard later on to actually go back and see what the transaction did. And so we built this infrastructure to store transaction hashes and then, pull them. And then when they were mined, kind of extract information about, okay, this is the smart contract that was deployed, this is the token that was minted, all of that. And it was like one of my team member, Akeem at the time, was like, hey, look, there's this thing called the Graph that just goes out that allows us to kind of not have to worry about that infrastructure. They actually build the mechanisms to handle changes on chain and kind of build a data store from these changes that we can then query, and we don't have to worry about that. And so that's at the time, Akeem built the first subgraph to use on Lark, and then we started to play with this and realized like, okay, this is much better than our own thing. And it's also much better, not just for us, but as an infrastructure. It's much better to have a protocol to retrieve data from chains that would be standard in a way that doesn't require us to make a billion RPC calls and would be kind of always up to date, but also even compatible with the fancier way to do data stores, which is GraphQL at this point. So realize like, okay, there's something really powerful around these shared protocol, because the Graph is a protocol that allow people to build application by abstracting away some of the complexities around querying blockchain nodes.
So you developed some early conviction for the Graph and the solution it provides long before any contemplation of joining the council or getting involved in the community.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't think there was a council at the time. So I, realized like, okay, this is valuable infrastructure for the Web3, but for the web down the line. And I do think that eventually, I know there's a bunch of efforts around IPFS indexing to the Graph. I do think at some point you can imagine the Graph being something that indexes content from all kinds of data sources, whether they're blockchains or not. I've been playing a lot with Blue Sky, the new Twitter clone. And I was like, okay, maybe there's actually some way of building subgraphs for Blue Sky that would allow me to query for specific things. And as long as you have ways to ensure that the data is correct, then building subgraphs that are queryable, that are indexed by multiple players is a good way of building this kind of infrastructure. If you think about the web, one of the most popular companies in the web is Google, and their only job has been to index the web. Only job, it's a pretty significant job, but index the web and kind of serve results fast. I do think that things like the Graph would allow us to build similar kind of search engines for data that is being published on chain, but also on other data sources, and then have this as a building block that any kind of website could integrate easily to, again, do the querying and the retrieval of data from multiple data sources.
Thank you for listening to part 1 of the Best of 2023. Next week, you'll hear part 2, so be sure to tune in for that special look back on the guests, ideas, and stories that shaped the GRTiQ podcast in 2023. This has been a production of the GRTiQ podcast. For more information, including detailed show notes, visit grtiq.com/podcast. That's grtiq.com/podcast.
Please consider contributing to this project and helping build the community by subscribing and leaving a review.
GRTiQ podcast.